Ramses II, also known as Ramses the Great, was the most celebrated pharaoh of the Egyptian Empire.
The mummy of Ramesses II's son is part of the quest for immortality, hidden treasure of Egypt in China.
Every image you've ever seen of him was made by his own propaganda department. Colossal, godlike, born to rule. That was the entire point. But Ramesses II was not born royal. 2 generations earlier, his family were army men from a marsh town on the far eastern edge of the Nile Delta, in a place Egypt had spent 100 years trying to forget. His grandfather was a commoner with a spear, and the god that family served was the one every other Egyptian was afraid of, the eastern Nile Delta, around 1300 BC. Forget the Egypt on the postcards. There are no golden cliffs here, no Valley of the Kings, no temples cut into sandstone. The delta is flat and wet and green, a spread of marsh and reed bed and shallow channel where the Nile comes apart before it reaches the sea. This is cattle country, border country. The ships from Canaan and Cyprus unloaded here. So did the traders, the mercenaries, and the armies. Thebes, hundreds of miles upriver, is where Egypt kept its gods. The delta is where Egypt kept its soldiers. And it is where a boy named Ramesses grew up, in a family with no claim to a throne, no royal cousins, and nothing to trade on except rank. His father was a troop commander named Seti, who carried the title Chief of Archers. His uncle was an army officer who had married into the temple establishment. Good family, absolutely not a royal one. Ramesses joined the army because that is what the men in his family did. And in any normal century, that is where the story would end. A competent officer in a border garrison, remembered by nobody. But this was not a normal century. Egypt had just come out of the strangest 50 years in its history. A pharaoh named Akhenaten had thrown out the entire religion, closed the old temples, moved the capital into empty desert, and told a country of 1,000 gods that only one of them mattered. When he died, the whole experiment collapsed. His city emptied out. His successors chiseled his name off the monuments. Tutankhamun, still a child, was put on the throne to put things back the way they were. And then he died too, at around 19, with no surviving heir. What followed was damage control. An old courtier named Ai held the throne for 4 years. Then, a general named Hormheb took power and spent his reign scrubbing the record clean, restoring the temples, rebuilding the army, and stitching a shaken country back together. And when Hormheb reached the end of his life, he had the same problem Tutankhamun had. No son, no heir, nobody with royal blood left standing. So he looked around his own government, and he picked the man he trusted most, his vizier, a career soldier from the Delta, Ramesses. Now, pay attention to this next detail, because it explains everything that comes after. Hormheb did not just choose a competent officer. He chose an old one, with a grown son and, possibly, a grandson already born. He was not filling one seat. That single decision bought 3 generations of stability. Ramesses took the throne as Ramesses I, ruled for less than 2 years, and died. His son Seti became pharaoh, and Seti's son would become the most famous ruler in Egyptian history. An entire dynasty, one of the greatest in the ancient world, started as a succession fix. But the interesting part is not how they got in, it is what they brought with them. Look at the names. The founder's father was called Seti, so was his grandson. Seti is not a neutral name. It means something closer to man of Set, and Set was not a comfortable god to be named after. Set was the god of storms, of the Red Desert, of chaos and foreigners and violence. In the oldest and most famous story Egypt told about itself, Set turns on his brother Osiris and scatters what is left of him across Egypt. He is the villain of the national myth. Every Egyptian schoolchild scratching hieroglyphs onto a broken pot knew who Set was and what he had done. Naming your son after him is a statement, and it goes further than the name. Ramesses I held a religious office before he ever held a crown. He was a priest of Set. His son held the same office after him. The temple attached to that priesthood stood in a town in the eastern delta called Avaris. That name matters more than any of the others. Avaris was not just any town. Avaris had been the capital of the Hyksos, the Western Asian rulers who took over northern Egypt for roughly a century and were violently expelled around 1550 BC. Driving them out was the founding heroic story of the New Kingdom. The moment Egypt told itself, it had thrown off foreign control forever. Avaris was the enemy capital, and Set was the god the Hyksos had adopted there. So here's the family that ends up ruling Egypt. Soldiers from the eastern frontier, priests of the god of chaos. Rooted in the town Egypt had spent centuries trying to erase, keeping alive a cult that had survived the expulsion, the propaganda, and everything in between. They never hid it. Ramesses II eventually put up a monument now known as the 400-year Stela, and the whole point of it was to celebrate 4 centuries of the Set cult in that exact place. He was not embarrassed by the connection. He was advertising it. That stone was later found reused at Tanis, and it is a strange object to hold in your head. A monument, raised by the most powerful man on earth, built for no other purpose than to count 400 years of unbroken worship for the god his own country, cast as the murderer in its national story. There is no apology anywhere on it, just a date, a god, and a family that had clearly been keeping score. Which brings us to the man himself. Ramesses II took the throne around 1279 BC and held it for 66 years. He fought the Hittites to a bloody draw at Kadesh, then worked out what survives as the earliest known peace treaty between 2 great powers, with copies that survive in both Egyptian and Hittite. His children were so numerous that historians have genuinely lost count. He lived to around 90, outliving at least a dozen of his own sons. But the reason you know his face is not Kadesh, and it is not the treaty. It is the marketing. Ramesses II ran the largest self-promotion campaign of the ancient world. The seated colossi at Abu Simbel, carved straight into a cliff face in Nubia, the Ramesseum on the west bank at Thebes, temples, obelisks, statues, and cartouches from the Delta to the Second Cataract. He carved his name deep into stone, deliberately, so that later kings could not sand it off the way Egypt had sanded off Akhenaten, and where older monuments already existed, his workmen simply recut them with his name. He was worshipped as a living god during his own lifetime, which very few pharaohs ever managed, and he built himself a brand new capital in the eastern delta and called it Pi-Ramesses, the House of Ramesses. He did not build it a safe distance from the old Hyksos capital. He built it right there, on the family's home ground, beside those ruins, in sight of the Temple of Set, the most Egyptian ruler in history, and he moved the seat of power out of the sacred south and back to the frontier his grandfather came from. That was only round 1, because everything I have just told you comes from what he wrote about himself. Stone that he commissioned, scenes he approved, a version of a life edited by the man living it. The other version was lying in a wooden coffin, and nobody read it for 3,000 years. Enter Pierre Fernand Ceccaldi. But first, how a pharaoh ends up on an examination table in Paris. In 1881, Egyptian authorities uncovered a hidden tomb in the cliffs at Deir el-Bahari, near Luxor. Inside was a cache of royal mummies, moved there long ago by priests trying to protect them from tomb robbers. Dozens of kings, stacked in a single shaft. Ramesses II was among them. He spent the next century in Cairo, and by the 1970s, he was rotting. A French physician named Maurice Bucaille examined the body and found a fungal infection eating into the tissue. Without treatment, the mummy would be gone. So Egypt sent him to France. And because anyone entering the country needed papers, Egypt issued travel documents for a man who had been dead for 3,000 years. The line everybody remembers is the one that reads occupation, king, deceased. In September of 1976, he landed at Le Bourget Airport outside Paris and was met on the tarmac by the Republican Guard and a red carpet with full state ceremony as a visiting head of state. And no, I am not making that up. Then they took him to a laboratory. The examination that followed was not a quick look. It ran across 4 separate French labs, including the National Atomic Energy Commission, a textile research institute, the cosmetics company L'Oréal, and the forensic laboratory of the Paris Criminal Identification Service, headed by Professor Pierre Fernand Ceccaldi. That last detail is the one people skip past. The man leading the analysis of the pharaoh's body was a crime lab scientist. The same discipline you would use on an unidentified body pulled out of the Seine was pointed at Ramesses the Great. If you are into this kind of investigation, hit subscribe. This channel takes the oldest questions we have about the human past and follows the evidence wherever it lands. While the world's press was still writing about the passport and the honor guard, the real work was happening quietly on a bench in a Paris laboratory. Ceccaldi took hair from the scalp and put it under a microscope. The hair on the mummy read as a reddish yellow. The obvious explanation was henna, a plant dye Egyptians used constantly, applied either in life or by the embalmers as part of the funeral preparation. And that is exactly what Ceccaldi found on the length of the hair. But hair keeps a record. Color fades and alters along the shaft over time, and dye sits on the outside. The root is different. The root holds the original pigment, and it holds it for a very long time. Ramesses II died an old man, and by then, his hair had gone white. The roots told a different story about the young man. Under magnification, the roots contained natural red pigment. This was not dye, not fading, and not a chemical trick of the embalming or the centuries underground. The team concluded that in his youth, this pharaoh had been a redhead. Chicaldi also cut the hairs in cross-section, found them oval rather than round, and concluded the hair had been wavy. The findings were published in 1985 in the official French volume on the mummy. The conclusion described a fair-skinned man with wavy red hair, closest in physical type to ancient populations of the Mediterranean and North Africa. Now, hold that next to everything you already know about this family. Red hair, in ancient Egypt, was associated with one god, Set, the red-haired, red-skinned lord of the desert. Chicaldi himself pointed at the connection, noting that the pharaoh's own father carried Set's name. A family of Set priests from the god's frontier city and the body of their most famous son comes back from a Paris crime lab with red in the roots of his hair. That is the part that still stops me. One small footnote to that trip. Decades later, French police detained a postman near Paris who was selling strands of hair and scraps of funeral wrapping online, asking around 2,000 euros. He said he had inherited them from his father, one of the researchers who worked on the mummy in the 1970s. Egypt asked for them back. Somewhere in a French evidence locker, pieces of a pharaoh sat in a bag, waiting to go home. There's a question everyone asks next, and the honest answer is more interesting than the rumor. Nobody has ever published the genome of Ramesses II. Egypt's heat is brutal on ancient DNA, and royal mummies are handled with extreme care. What we have instead is his world. Read through the DNA of the people around him. In 2012, a team including Zahi Hawass and the ancient DNA specialist Albert Zink tested the mummy of Ramesses III, a pharaoh who took the same throne roughly 30 years after Ramesses II died. They also tested an unidentified body known only as Unknown Man E, wrapped in a goat skin instead of linen, which is close to a curse in Egyptian funeral terms. The genetic profiles came back as father and son. Their shared paternal line was predicted as a lineage called E1B1A, which today is most common in West and Central Africa. Then in 2017, researchers from Tübingen and the Max Planck Institute pulled DNA from mummies at a site called Abu Sir el Malek. 90 maternal genomes, plus genome-wide data from 3 individuals. The findings surprised people. Those ancient Egyptians shared more ancestry with populations of the ancient Near East than modern Egyptians do, and modern Egyptians carry more sub-Saharan African ancestry than that ancient sample did. The population changed after the pharaohs, not before them. And then, in July of 2025, in the journal Nature, the wall finally came down. A team from the Francis Crick Institute and Liverpool John Moores University, led by Adeline Moraz-Jacobs, sequenced the first complete genome ever recovered from ancient Egypt. The man came from a rock-cut tomb at Nouverat, buried inside a sealed ceramic pot, which is probably the only reason his DNA survived at all. He lived between 4,500 and 4,800 years ago, when the first pyramids were going up. Around 80% of his ancestry traced to North African Neolithic populations. Around 20% traced east to the Fertile Crescent and Mesopotamia. That was not trade goods or borrowed ideas. That was people moving and having children. The same data predicted his appearance. Brown eyes, brown hair, dark skin, one man from one grave, 1,000 years before the pharaoh we are talking about, which is the whole point. 2 individuals from the same country, separated by more time than separates us from ancient Rome, and they would not have looked alike. So the picture that comes out of the last 15 years of genetics is not the one anybody was arguing about. Ancient Egypt was never one sealed population. It was a North African core with a deep thread running back into Western Asia, sitting on the busiest crossroads in the ancient world, absorbing everyone who came through it, which is exactly the kind of country that produces a family like his. There's one more piece, and it is the closest we have come to standing in front of him. Between 2005 and 2009, Sahar Salim, a radiologist at Cairo University, ran the royal mummies through a CT scanner, a machine that stacks thousands of X-ray slices into a 3-dimensional model. No unwrapping, no cutting. In 2023, working with Caroline Wilkinson and the Face Lab at Liverpool John Moores University, she used that scan data to rebuild his face with the same forensic software police use to identify unknown remains. Then they ran it backwards. Age regression, stripping decades off the model to show him at about 45, in the middle of his reign, at the height of his power. The scans show the rest of it too. A spine locked up with arthritis that had bent him into a hunch, a worn-out hip, an abscess at the root of the left second molar that would have hurt every day for years, pierced ears, a strong hooked nose, a man who lived so long that his body simply wore through. He was a real person, and he hurt. And that is the thing the statues were built to hide. Ramesses II was not born a god. He was the grandson of an archer from a border town, from a family that kept faith with the god of storms and the desert, in a country whose ancestry ran from North Africa out into Western Asia. He inherited a throne because an old general needed a safe pair of hands, and then he spent 66 years carving a different story into every flat surface in Egypt. It worked. 3,000 years later, his is the face people picture when they hear the word Pharaoh. But somewhere in a museum in Cairo lies a small, dried, 90-year-old man with a bad hip and red in the roots of his hair. And he is far more interesting than the giant he built. If you want the rest of this story, the video on screen goes into the royal cache at Deir el-Bahari, the hidden shaft where dozens of Egypt's kings were stacked in the dark, and the family of tomb robbers who found them first.